In 2019, I started my journey into road car racing with HPDE program at NASA Great Lakes. In October 2025, I graduated into DE4. I'm going to share my lessons learned at each stage, the pace that I learned at, some of the cars I went through, and some anecdotes just for the sake of my own personal memory of the whole experience. I expect other students to get some value out of this video. I know I wish I'd had a video like this to compare my own experiences to when I was starting out or feeling a little lost along the way. I'd also heard about students flying through the DE program in a year or two. I always felt like a bit of an oddball. HPD instructors and NASA leaders might also like to get an idea of what development and progress might look like for a student. So I guess it starts for me with 5 laps in a Ferrari while I was in Vegas back in 2016. I was too green to make it around the track without the instructor grabbing the wheel and saving my keister, but I could already see that some of my video game racing experiences as a kid was genuinely applicable. So that was kind of exciting. In 2019, I bought a Lotus and I trailered it to NASA HPDE 1 at Autobahn Country Club. At this stage, I learned visual markers, for break points, turn-ins, apex. I'd learned this in video games, but it took practice to learn how to apply it. It was exciting to see that what I'd already learned with Gran Turismo 2 when I was a kid actually applied to some degree. It was nice. I learned about flags, their meanings, and more than anything, I learned how incredibly important they are and how difficult it is to actually pay attention to all of them. They're as important as they are difficult to be aware of. I learned about weight and traction. At this point in my learning, it was really intellectual or academic. I wasn't actually pushing the car enough to really see the difference and how the weight transitions were impacting traction. But I understood it at some level. I learned about threshold braking. I could just about put a passenger through the windshield. I mean, my corner entry speed was imperfect, but I could genuinely threshold brake the first time I tried. Classroom teachers told me that I might think I'm threshold braking, but I'm not. But the in-car instructors were always really impressed. In DE1, I also learned about understeer and how to deal with that. It's pretty easy, right? You just let off the gas and steer where you want to go, and it generally all corrects itself eventually. Oversteer, on the other hand, was something I was really only learning in class. Not only was I not really getting oversteer ever, but I think, I still had my nannies on, all my traction control systems on in my car, so it just wasn't a part of my learning yet, really. 2 years later, in 2021, I returned to HPDE 1 in a Corvette Grand Sport. I loaded a trailer that was way too big behind a truck that was way too small to pull it, and the whole adventure was kind of a nightmare. My muffler fell off the truck about halfway through Illinois. All in all, I learned some hard lessons about properly trailering a vehicle. Anyhow, I learned about late entry versus early entry. And at this stage, I mostly use this knowledge to keep me safe, not so much to make me faster. I would realize when something was an early entry that could put me off track and avoid it, and I would use exaggerated late entry in order to give myself lots of margin to make mistakes. This also meant that the wheel was turned more than it needed to be turned, which generally meant I was going through corners kind of slow. I also made friends. I met Daniel. I'd met him my first weekend in my Lotus. Daniel had cancer, and he'd had it for years and years. But he kept chugging, and it just didn't seem to bother him at all. I often forgot that he had cancer altogether. We met in classroom. We cat and moused on track. We had beers in the paddocks, and we kept in touch to coordinate going to the same next events. After 2 events in 3 years, I graduated HPDE 1. Unfortunately, Daniel couldn't make it. He died of cancer. I think of him often when I'm on grid and I'm alone in my car and the grid workers are blowing the 3 and 1 minute whistles. In 2022, I bought a 1995 E36 M3 track car, all track prepped with cage, harnesses, cooling, etc. I decided crashing is inevitable and I want it to cost as little as possible. I brought it to 2 HPDE events and it broke immediately at both of them. I spent $4,000 trying to fix the car and finally just sold it for $8,000 less than I'd bought it for. It was the most horrific financial experience of my life, and I had about 4 laps of track time to show for it over the course of the entire summer. with no driving lessons learned in the entire year of 2022. So I decided to rent track cars. And if I'm going to rent, might as well fly somewhere exciting. In 2023, I did 100 laps in a Spec Miata at Laguna Seca, and I rented a Ford FR 500 Mustang from Steve Poe at NASA's Autobahn event. In 2024, I rented a Spec Iron Mustang. I started having fun and learning more. First of all, I had traction control off now. It's time to take control of my destiny if I get oversteer. I've never had traction control since HPDE 1. At this point, I was still terrified of oversteer though, and anytime I got it, it felt more like something I had survived. Look at my death grip on that steering wheel. I thought I was relaxed in that moment. I don't drive like that anymore. I also learned about rotation in slow corners. This was a lot of fun. Brakes and wheel angle means oversteer, but if it's intentional, we call it rotation, and this was a safe and easy way to get more and more comfortable with oversteer. It was a lot of fun. I also learned about track analysis. Which turns are worth the most lap time, which have the greatest risk factor and aren't worth pushing past the limit. I also learned flags. Flags were something that I'd already learned, but I was starting to learn just how hard it is to see every flag and how important it is. At this stage, I thought I was very good with flags. I missed a debris on track flag going into the corkscrew at Laguna Seca. And not only did I just barely make the corkscrew, but I thought, hey, that must have been my mistake. Because I hadn't seen the flag, I thought, I have something to learn about my braking here. I'll have to remember that next time I come around. And so I went into the high-speed sweeper that follows the corkscrew at like maybe 90 miles per hour, 80, 90 miles per hour, with brake fluid on my tires. And I was very lucky not to go off into a wall right there. This footage, by the way, is not from that incident. This is just some other laps I was running. That was a wake-up call to start running flag awareness drills every single event, even if I was working on other things at the same time. Around this time, I also lost a lot of my fear of just sliding off the road. When I first started this sport, I felt like if I slide off this track, I'm gonna crash and it's gonna be awful. I think I realized how many different ways there are to slide off the track without anybody getting hurt. Zero impact slides happen very frequently. In fact, as I began to play with things more and more, I was kind of constantly at least putting 2 off. And several times I'd go 4 wheels off and return, and it's just not a big deal. And then in those rare cases you do actually hit something, it's even more rare that a driver's actually hurt in any way. So some of my fear of simple spins and slides was less and less on my mind. Around this time, I started to drive as fast as I want. Maybe not as fast as I can. Traction loss was rare. Wheel corrections were very rare, and I wasn't near as on the limit as I thought I was. But I was driving about as fast as a car could go without risking real oversteer. I also started to drive with big sticky tires, slicks. They don't let go all of a sudden like I'd been taught in HPDE 1. DE1 instructors warned that slicks don't communicate and they lose traction more suddenly, which can surprise you. And I found that difference, it's only audible. You know, that's only true in terms of how they make noise. They don't screech to warn you when they're getting close, but the feeling is otherwise the same. And once I realized that, I was no longer intimidated by them, and I've been using them ever since anytime I get my hands on them. I also started making more friends. The community started to be something I'd look forward to maybe as much as the cars. So in October 2024, I graduated to HPDE 3. After that, things really changed. In 2025, I rented the Spec Iron Mustang 4 times, and something major changed after the first event. I'd been listening to Ross Bentley's podcast, Speed Secrets, and it aligned with classroom discussion around the idea of traction. I learned about maximizing traction and prioritizing that over getting the line exactly right. Wait till you're barely hanging on to the limit and then try to get that to happen online. Once I switched that around, I was driving like a whole new person. I also thought about the dozens, if not hundreds of times I've purposely pulled an e-brake in the snow during Minnesota winters and countersteered through it just for fun. So I put these thoughts together and I realized if there's more traction available for me to turn the wheel, I'm going to. And if the thing oversteers, I can handle it. that psychological change was immense. I started positively wheeling it around the track. And this was not a gradual thing. I just went out there knowing I could do it, and I did it. One day I was afraid of oversteer, and the next day I just went out there and said, it's time to oversteer around every corner if I can. A spec iron racer actually came for a ride-along and said that I make more wheel corrections per lap than he does when he's racing competitively. Now that's not necessarily a good thing, nor the fastest way around the track, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is this galactic shift in my comfort that happened in DE3. In DE1 and 2, I used to seriously say out loud before every grid release, goal number 1 is don't crash. Goal number 2, don't crash. I haven't heard myself say that in a long time. Now it's more like, I'm gonna take small sips of speed until I'm positively sending this thing and wheeling it. And if I crash, that's fine too, because I'm in a cheap-ass race car. That change just came from the realization that I could simply turn the wheel more, combined with my memories of all the times I'd steered through oversteer just fine. I put those two things together and just realized I could do it. HPDE 3 is when everything academic came together on track and became a practical skill. I learned oversteer is not something you correct smoothly or slowly. When the back starts to move, you put the steering wheel right where it needs to be immediately to compensate. I learned to tap up, which is something I'd learned about in previous, in DE1 and 2, but I wasn't doing it. And in DE3, I was tapping up. Of course, that means making sure that the brakes are ready, the brake pads are in place by tapping the brakes on straightaways. Our RPM checks for hotter entry, if I realize I might be getting a hot entry, I now have visual markers at various points on the track so that I know to check if my RPM is higher than usual so I can adjust braking points. Not doing that has caused me to go off track in the past. I've mastered heel toe. I'm also driving on the limit with a consistent mix of oversteer and understeer. No longer driving as fast as I want, but as fast as I can. I've also learned I can only do that though on tracks I've fully learned. For example, at NCM at the end of the season here in HPDE 3, I noticed I couldn't quite drive on the limit as much because I wasn't done learning the track. I learned rotation at higher speeds. I was taught to do this only in lower speed corners, but I loved it so much I started doing it everywhere, including high speed corners. I was trail braking and rotating at 75 miles per hour in turn 4 at Autobahn. It's questionable whether that's worthwhile in that corner, and it's definitely not worthwhile in any other high speed corners. But I just fell in love with rotation and wanted to experiment everywhere. I no longer do this at higher speeds, but I consider it a really useful learning period when I had a bit of a fling with trail braking and kind of overdid it until I really understood it. It never bit me. I caught it every time. That might be luck to some degree. I also learned about smoothness in coming off the brakes or brake release, and how important that is for a faster entry and for better lap times. So just building on that idea of smooth brakes, I now use the brakes as a tool to go directly to my highest possible entry speed, and that's what the brake is meant to do. I rarely threshold brake now, and my lap times are much faster. I understand that for wheel-to-wheel racing, I need to learn to combine the skills of threshold braking with a perfect entry speed in order to defend a line. But right now, I'm perfectly thrilled with my ability to do one or the other pretty much perfectly. I also learned the benefits of a race car. I started to go off track more. And once into the gravel in China Beach at Mid-Ohio and also into Turn 9 Armco at NCM. I don't have either on video, but the off into gravel cost me nothing. Whereas if I had that happen in my 2020 Corvette, it would have been thousands and thousands of dollars in damage. When I hit the Armco at NCM, I hit the back of the car and spun and hit the front of the car, and it cost less than $2,000 in damages to the vehicle. If that had happened in my 2020 Corvette, it would have been totaled, and I'm sure I'd be out over $60,000. So I really learned that benefit of having a dedicated track car. On October 19th, 2025, I graduated to HPDE 4. It was my 4th event that year, my 9th event in total, if you don't count my weekends with a dead BMW. Every step of the way was impossible without me using my brain and controlling my own future. But it also only happened because NASA was carefully planning, a path and cultivating a sort of rich soil for drivers to grow in. And in retrospect, I really appreciate that. I also found a sense of community I hadn't experienced before. So I'm usually the sort of extrovert who dances and sings without needing to drink any liquor. And it's not like I've had a real loss of interaction or community too much in my life. Yet somehow being in the paddocks and in classroom at the track always leaves me feeling like I've never really known how good community could be. So yeah, I've loved it. Anyhow, that was my HPDE 1 to 4 experience. So see you at the track next time, guys.